The morning was gray and cold, and the woman who answered the door of number 14, Royal Crescent, was neither a maid nor a housekeeper, though the man on the step would not have known the difference from where he stood. He was tall in the doorway's frame, dressed without ornament in a dark coat that wanted no decoration to announce its quality. And he held his hat at his side with the patience of someone accustomed to being received immediately. Behind him, the Crescent's curved face of pale stone stretched away in both directions, and the October light lay flat against it, offering nothing. Josephine Hartley looked at him steadily. She was 23 years old, neatly dressed in a gray wool morning gown that had been let out once at the seam, and showed it only if one looked closely. And she had learned, in 4 months of service to Lady Sutherland, to look at callers with a pleasant neutrality that said nothing and cost her very little. "Lady Sutherland receives no callers she does not previously know," she said. "If you would care to leave your card, I will see it is put before her." The man did not move. He did not, precisely, look affronted, which surprised her. Men of his evident station generally did one of 3 things when told no at a door. They argued, they drew themselves up, or they left with a performance of dignity that was meant to punish. This one simply looked at her, with gray eyes that held nothing she could read, and said, "I have no card on my person this morning. You will forgive the oversight." "Then I am afraid I cannot help you, sir." "No," he said after a pause in which she heard the Bath sparrows in the iron railings and the distant clatter of a coalman's cart on the far side of the Crescent. "I suppose you cannot at present." He inclined his head. He walked back down the 3 front steps and through the iron gate and turned left along the pavement without another word, and Josephine shut the door and stood a moment in the entrance hall with her hand still on the latch, listening to his footsteps until they faded. She did not allow herself to wonder who he was. She could not afford to wonder about things that were not her concern. What she did not know, and would not know for some time, was that he stood at the far corner of Royal Crescent for a full 3 minutes after she shut the door, looking back at number 14 with an expression no one was there to see, and that the expression on his face was not irritation. It was the look of a man who has found something he had stopped expecting to find, and who is in the process of deciding what to do about it. Josephine Hartwell had come to Bath in June, after the funeral. Her father, the Reverend Charles Hartley, had died in May of a congestion of the lungs that had taken him from his study to his bed, and from his bed to the churchyard in the space of 3 weeks, leaving behind a house that belonged to the living, a library that had to be sold, and 2 children who had no income between them and no relatives inclined to inconvenience themselves on their behalf. Edmund, 17, and in his 2nd year at school, could not be removed without destroying the one prospect Charles Hartley had carefully arranged for his son. Josephine, who had educated herself in the margins of her father's library and spoken French with sufficient precision to occasionally correct the curate, wrote 6 letters in the fortnight after the funeral and accepted the one offer that arrived in return. Lady Sutherland was 61, a widow with bad knees and a genuine fondness for whist, and she wanted a companion who could read aloud without stumbling, manage the household's morning callers without requiring instruction, and refrain from having an opinion about the decorating. Josephine could do all 3. Lady Sutherland paid £12 a quarter, which was not a fortune, but was £12 more than Josephine had. And Bath was close enough to Edmund's school in Bristol that she could send a weekly letter by the post and know it would arrive within 2 days. She had been at number 14 for 4 months when she turned the tall man away at the door. She would think about him again the following morning when a card appeared on the silver salver in the entrance hall, with no memory of how it had arrived, because she had not been the one to receive it. The card read, in a hand that was neither flourished nor cramped, but simply precise, James Alderton, Duke of Carlow. She held it for a moment longer than was necessary. Lady Sutherland's other callers had cards that named them as the wives or daughters of baronets, the occasional county magistrate, a canon of Bath Abbey who came for the whist. A duke was a different kind of name entirely. She put the card face down on the salver and carried it in to Lady Sutherland, who was sitting by the fire with her knee elevated on a footstool and a copy of the Morning Post in her lap. "A card, ma'am." Lady Sutherland turned it over, read it, and looked at Josephine with a sharp, interested expression that she rarely wore before noon. "Carlow, well, I turned him away yesterday, ma'am, as you instructed. I know you did, my dear. Mrs. Hobbs mentioned it. He left a card rather than a complaint, which is notable." Lady Sutherland tapped the card against her palm. "He may call tomorrow at 11. Send him the word." Josephine sent the word by the afternoon post. She did not examine why she felt, as she sealed the envelope, a faint unsteadiness in her chest that she was careful to press down before she returned to her needlework. He came at 11 the following morning, and she was not, as it happened, the one who received him. Lady Sutherland's maid showed him into the drawing-room, and Josephine was sent for after 20 minutes. In the way one sends for a reference book one wishes to consult. She came in to find him standing at the window overlooking the Crescent Garden, his hands clasped behind his back, his profile still as quarried granite against the pewter sky. He turned when she entered, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, which was not done, and both of them did it anyway. "Miss Hartley," Lady Sutherland said from her chair, "His Grace has expressed a wish to be introduced properly." "I am not, I think, quite a stranger," he said, addressing Josephine rather than Lady Sutherland, which was also not done. "Though I understand you received me as one." "You were unknown to the household," Josephine said. "The rule is not mine." "No," he agreed. "But you applied it." She did not know what to do with that observation, and so she did not do anything. She sat in the chair Lady Sutherland indicated, folded her hands in her lap, and spent the remainder of the call discussing the comparative merits of the Pump Room concerts with a man who was, she decided, the most carefully contained person she had ever encountered. He did not volunteer anything about himself. He answered questions with a precision that discouraged further inquiry. He drank his tea and refused the biscuits, and stood to take his leave at exactly 30 minutes' duration, which was correct. At the door, he paused. Not theatrically. He simply paused, with his hat in his hand. "Good morning, Miss Hartley." It was the second time he had said her name. She noticed this the way one notices a sound one cannot identify, which is to say, with a quiet alert attention one does not entirely acknowledge. "Good morning, Your Grace." The door closed. Josephine returned to her mending. She told herself she thought about him no further, and she was almost entirely correct. The trouble with being a lady's companion in Bath in the autumn of 1813 was that the city was not, quite, the city it had been. The upper rooms still held their assemblies on Tuesdays and Fridays. The pump room still dispensed water and conversation in roughly equal measure. The Crescent still housed the kind of widow who required a companion with a reliable French accent and no domestic inconveniences of her own. But the war had taken men, and the season had thinned, and the people who came to Bath now came more often to convalesce than to display, which meant that Josephine's life inside Lady Sutherland's house was smaller and quieter than she had imagined it would be when she wrote that 6th letter in June. She was not unhappy. She had her father's copy of Johnson's dictionary, which she had kept back from the library sale by hiding it beneath her winter shawls, and she had her weekly letters from Edmund, which were misspelled in the confident way of a boy who did not consider spelling a serious matter, and she had the small private pleasure of managing Lady Sutherland's household affairs with a precision the Baroness never entirely noticed and never expected. She ordered the coal. She negotiated the butcher's bill. She arranged the morning visitors and refused the unsuitable ones, and never once complained to Lady Sutherland about any of it. She had, in other words, made herself indispensable in the particular way of someone who knows that indispensability is the only form of security available to her. And then one Thursday morning in November, she was returning from the post office on Milsom Street with Edmund's weekly letter in her hand, when she turned the corner of Old Bond Street and found a red-faced man in a brown coat standing outside the Mrs. Farthing's boarding house with a large school trunk at his feet and a boy of 17 standing beside it, with his jaw set at an angle that was entirely his father's. Edmund had not written that he was in Bath. Edmund had not written that there was a matter requiring settling. Edmund had not written anything at all about the £8 outstanding on his autumn term account, which Mr. Farthing's representative was now explaining, in a voice designed to be heard by passers-by, constituted a debt of honor and a serious irregularity. Josephine walked the 20 yards between them with the particular controlled pace of someone who is determining, as she walks, exactly what she can afford. £12 a quarter. It was now the middle of November, which meant she had received £6 at Michaelmas, and had spent £4 3 shillings on replacements for Lady Sutherland's woolen stockings, a new pen nib, £2 of good tea, and a pair of sensible boots that had been necessary rather than desirable. She had £1 17 shillings in the small tin box on her bedroom shelf. She had a quarter day coming in December. Lady Sutherland would advance it if asked properly. She had never asked. She stopped in front of the man in the brown coat, made herself look at him with the same pleasant neutrality she used on unsuitable callers, and said, "I am Miss Hartley. I am prepared to settle the account in full. If you will accompany me to the house, I will draw the funds immediately." The man in the brown coat looked at her with the practiced skepticism of someone who has heard this phrase before. Edmund looked at her with an expression of relief so acute that she felt it in her own chest like a bruise. She drew £6 11 shillings from Lady Sutherland's domestic accounts, which she replaced by writing a careful note to herself in the household ledger, and paid the man the full £8 by combining it with all but £1 9 shillings of her own remaining money, and she did not look at Edmund's face while she did it, because she could not afford the emotion of it. What she did not know was that there was a man across the street who had been walking from the circulating library on Milsom Street toward the Crescent when he saw her turn the corner, and who had stopped, instinctively and without decision, at the iron railings across from Farthing's boarding house, and watched the entire transaction from 50 feet away, his hat in his hand, and his face entirely still. James had seen the set of her shoulders when she walked those 20 yards. He had seen the precise, unhurried quality of her address to the agent, and the way she did not look at the boy until the money had changed hands and the man had gone, and the way she then turned to her brother and said something brief and low that made the boy straighten and nod and not quite cry. He had watched her walk away with £1 9 shillings left in the world, and a composure that was not performance, but structure, the way a good wall is structure, built because there is weather to be withstood. He had not moved until she turned out of sight. He did not examine why. If you have stayed with Josephine this far, leave a word in the comments. Stories like hers were lived in the margins of history, and they deserve to be heard. The Duke of Carlo called at number 14 the following Monday, and the call was shorter than the first. He came at 11, stayed 20 minutes, drank no tea, and said nothing about Milsom Street. He asked about the pump room concerts and was informed they had been adequate. He asked whether Lady Sutherland intended to attend the upper room's assembly on Friday. She did not, due to the knee. He thanked her and took his leave. But at the door, he said to Josephine, who was holding it open, as was her function, "Miss Hartley, your brother is at school in Bristol, I think." It was not a question, which was the thing that alarmed her. She kept her face in order with some effort. "He is, Your Grace." "He has the look of you about the eyes," James said. He had not been close enough on Milsom Street to see Edmund's eyes. Josephine understood then that he was not speaking about eyes at all, and the understanding sat in the center of her chest like something swallowed wrong. "Good day, Your Grace." He inclined his head and left, and she did not allow herself to think about what he had seen or what it meant that he had chosen to tell her he had seen it, and she failed at the not thinking for most of the evening, sitting over her mending with the candle burning lower than it should. The Duchess of Carlow arrived in Bath the second week of November with her preferred companion, Miss Cecily Vane, and 4 outriders, and she took rooms at the York House Hotel that were precisely sufficient to the dignity of a dowager duchess, and not a square foot more. Lady Dorothea Alderton was 63 years old, straight-backed and clear-eyed, with a talent for the social order that had the quality of genuine expertise. She had managed 3 London seasons, 2 political dinners that required the seating of men who actively wished each other harm, and the complicated aftermath of her husband's death, all without perceptible effort, because the social order was not, for her, an external thing she navigated. It was the medium she lived in, the way a fish lives in water, without considering it remarkable or requiring it to be questioned. Miss Vane was 20 years old, fair-haired, and possessed of the confident composure of a girl who had been told from infancy that she was the correct choice for any room she entered. She wore a pale blue pelisse trimmed with white fox fur when she arrived, and the Bath ladies who saw her alight from the carriage at York House agreed, in their various drawing rooms that afternoon, that she was a handsome girl who wore her station easily. Josephine learned of their arrival through Mrs. Hobbs, the housekeeper, who had it from the cook at No. 7, who had it from a footman at York House. She noted it and thought very little about it, which was her general policy toward things she could not affect. She revised this policy on the Wednesday of that week, when she was collecting Lady Sutherland's prescriptions from the apothecary on Cheap Street, and encountered Lady Dorothea and Miss Vane coming the other direction, attended by a maid. Josephine stepped aside, as was appropriate. Lady Dorothea's gaze moved across her with the smooth efficiency of someone cataloguing the room's furniture, pausing briefly on Josephine's gray gown and the plain wool mantle over it, and moved on. "Lady Sutherland's companion," the dowager said, as they passed, in a tone designed to carry precisely far enough. "A penniless nobody, I am told." Miss Vane said nothing. She looked at Josephine with a brief, curious expression, and then looked away. Josephine walked the rest of the way to the apothecary with her hand steady in her muff and the words sitting in her ears, which was where she put them. And she did not take them out again until she was back in her room that evening, at which point she sat with them for perhaps 10 minutes before deciding that they were accurate in the respects that mattered to Lady Dorothea, and that accurate was not the same as definitive. She did not tell Lady Sutherland. She did not tell Edmund, who would have been uselessly furious from Bristol. She told Johnson's dictionary, silently, while she read, and the dictionary said nothing in return, which was the appropriate response. James called again on the Friday. This time, Lady Sutherland left them to discuss the morning's newspaper while she went to lie down before noon, which was, Josephine thought, either an act of trust or an act of strategy, and she was not certain Lady Sutherland herself knew which. They sat on opposite sides of the fire and discussed Bonaparte's retreat and the probable outcome of the Vienna questions, and the relative reliability of the Bath Chronicle. And James asked her, at some point in the middle of the Vienna questions, whether she had always read the political pages, which was not the kind of question one asked a lady's companion, and Josephine said, "My father considered it a fundamental part of a useful education." And James was quiet for a moment, with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the fire, and then said, "He sounds like a man worth knowing." "He was," she said. He looked at her then, directly and without the careful, managed quality he usually brought to looking at people, and she saw in that unguarded second something that was not the cold competence she had assigned to him. It was a specific kind of recognition, the look of someone who has lost a thing they valued and sees it named unexpectedly in another person's grief. She looked back at the fire. He sat back in his chair. The coal settled. "I had a ward," he said, after a silence long enough that it might have meant nothing. "A child. Clara. She was 8 years old." Josephine did not speak because he had not finished, and she understood that he was not a man who said things he had not considered. "She died in September of last year," he said, "of a fever. I was in London. There was business with the estate's accounts that I had judged required my attention, and I left Carlow Hall in the hands of my housekeeper, who is a capable woman, and of the local physician, who is also a capable man." He paused. She was gone before I could reach her. The fire cracked. The Bath sparrows were audible again in the street, small and relentless. "I judged the accounts worth my presence," he said, "and I was wrong. That is all." Josephine did not say that it was not his fault, because he had not asked her to say so, and she understood that fault was not the point. The point was judgment, and what it cost when it failed. She understood that very precisely. "There is a portrait of her in the gallery at Carlow Hall," he said, and stopped. "You do not go in," she said. It was not a question. He looked at her as though she had said something surprising. "No," he said. "I do not." They sat another 10 minutes before Lady Sutherland's maid appeared with the signal that her ladyship was ready to come down, and James rose and took his leave with the correct forms and the correct incline of the head, and Josephine watched him go with something in her chest that was in the wrong register for any category she had available for it. She thought, walking back to her mending, that she had made a serious error in admitting that she understood him. She thought, threading her needle in the diminishing November light, that it did not matter, because a duke who had a wound and a dowager mother did not constitute a circumstance she had any right to map herself onto. She had £12 a quarter, and a brother in Bristol, and a drawer with Johnson's dictionary in it, and she was going to be very sensible about this. She was sensible about it for exactly 11 days. The campaign Lady Dorothea waged against her was not crude. It had the precision of someone who knew that crude was unnecessary when the social machinery could be operated by someone with the standing to operate it. She called on Lady Sutherland twice in a fortnight. The first call was entirely pleasant, in the way that certain weather is pleasant while producing nothing one can identify as a cloud. The second call lasted 45 minutes, and Josephine was not in the room for 30 of them, because Lady Sutherland sent her to supervise the kitchen arrangements before the conversation arrived at its actual subject. She heard the end of it, though, because the drawing-room door was not fully latched, and the Crescent's houses had an acoustic generosity that their builders had not intended. "A girl of good family," Lady Dorothea said, in the measured tone she would have used to explain a household management principle, "is not well served by proximity to someone whose situation is ambiguous. The connection forms an impression, however unjustly." "Josephine's situation is entirely clear," Lady Sutherland said, with a flatness that Josephine had rarely heard from her. It is clear that she is a clergyman's daughter, with no income and no prospects, Lady Dorothea said, and that she has been frequenting the same parlor as my son, whom she turned away at the door. On my instructions, Lady Sutherland said, I am aware. The silence that followed was the kind produced when one woman recognizes that another has just reminded her, very gently, of the precise weight each of them carries in any room in England. The notice came the following Thursday. Lady Sutherland gave it herself, in person, in the drawing-room at 9 in the morning, and she had the look of someone doing a thing they have decided to do because they cannot see the alternative, which is different from the look of someone doing a thing they want to do. A month's wages in lieu, she said, setting the envelope on the table between them. And my best recommendation to any position you seek. I am sorry, my dear. Josephine looked at the envelope and kept her face in order. I understand, ma'am. You do not deserve it, Lady Sutherland said. It is not a matter of desert, Josephine said. It is a matter of circumstance. She took the envelope and went to her room, and sat on the bed, and looked at the wall, which was plain plaster, and gave her nothing, which was appropriate. And then she performed the arithmetic she had been performing since she heard the drawing-room door. £12 in the envelope. £1 9 shillings still remaining from her last quarter. Total, £13 9 shillings. Edmund's next term fee was due in January, and it was £9 6 shillings, and after that she had £4 3 shillings to live on until she found another position, in a city she was about to be asked to leave in November, at a moment when households did not engage companions at short notice. She did not leave Bath. She wrote a letter to Mr. Grantley, the Carlow family's solicitor, whose name she had seen on a letter in Lady Sutherland's hall stand, and asked in the most formal terms she could construct whether he handled any matters pertaining to independent legal advice, in case he did, which was a very long way of saying that she needed someone to tell her what Edmund's options were if she could not meet the January fee. Mr. Grantley, who was a meticulous and unexpectedly kind man, wrote back within 2 days to say he did not practice independently, but that he would be glad to direct her to a colleague who did, and that he hoped her present difficulty would resolve itself. The letter had an odd quality to it, as though it had been written by someone who knew rather more than its words contained. She moved from number 14 to a room above a milliner's shop on Trim Street, which was clean and adequately warm, and cost 4 shillings a week. And she wrote no one about the change of address except Edmund, who wrote back immediately in his large misspelled hand to say he was coming to Bath, to which she wrote back at equal speed to say he was absolutely not. She went to the upper rooms on the following Tuesday because Lady Sutherland, who maintained a genuine affection for her despite the notice, had pressed 2 tickets on her, and because Josephine was not, whatever her circumstances, going to spend her evenings in a room above a milliner's shop on Trim Street, if she had 2 upper rooms tickets and a clean gown. The gown was lavender silk that had been her mother's and had been remade twice, most recently in Bath in September, by a dressmaker on Quiet Street who had done good work within the limits of the fabric's remaining life. It was not what the room wore. The room wore figured muslin and jacquard ribbon and fresh sprig patterns in the year's fashionable colors, and beside it, Josephine's lavender was a quiet and slightly faded thing, which she knew and had decided to know without feeling it too acutely. She was standing near the east wall with a glass of lemonade she had no particular desire to drink when she heard Lady Dorothea's voice from 3 feet away, carrying to the general company with the ease of someone who has never needed to project. The Baroness's companion. I had rather thought she had removed herself by now. Josephine did not turn. She did not need to. Still in Bath? This was Miss Vane, light and easy, and not especially interested. I heard she had been given notice. "She has been given notice," Lady Dorothea confirmed. "A penniless nobody with no establishment and a schoolboy brother she cannot support. One wonders what she finds to attach herself to." The room did not precisely go quiet, because polished rooms of that kind never precisely go quiet. But the conversation in the immediate vicinity took on that particular quality of attention that is produced when everyone within hearing range understands that something is occurring and has decided to listen while maintaining the form of not listening. Josephine set her lemonade glass down on the tray of a passing footman. She straightened the cuffs of her lavender gown. She turned and looked directly at Lady Dorothea and said, in a voice she kept entirely level, "I am in Bath, ma'am, because I have a matter of business to settle before I go. I will trouble this room very little longer." Lady Dorothea looked at her with the thoughtful expression of someone recognizing that the furniture has spoken and finding it mildly inconvenient. It was at this moment that Josephine became aware, through some instinct she could not have named, that the quality of the room had changed behind her. She turned her head and saw James crossing the upper room's floor toward her, with the particular stride of someone who has seen something and made a decision and is now acting on it, and the expression on his face was the one he had worn at the fire when he spoke about Clara, and it was aimed entirely at her. The room watched. The room always watched. That was the one reliable thing about such rooms. He stopped in front of her. Not at a social distance. Close enough that she could see the exact gray of his eyes and the controlled set of his jaw, and the specific quality of his attention, which was not polite, and not warm, and not any of the words she had been using for it. Because it was, she understood suddenly, none of those things. It was a form of certainty. "Miss Hartley," he said. His mother's fan stopped moving. "Miss Hartley," he said again, and took her hand from where it hung at her side, which was done in front of every person in the eastern half of the upper room's assembly, and was therefore not nothing. "I find that I have remained a stranger long enough." He was not addressing the room. He was not speaking for the record. He was speaking to her, which was the thing she had not expected, and which accordingly did not arrive in any register she had prepared for. "Your Grace," she said, which was all she had. "I intend," he said quietly enough that only she and the nearest 6 people could hear it, "to call on you tomorrow morning, if you will permit it." "I am no longer at Royal Crescent," she said, before she could stop herself. "I know where you are," he said. "I have known since Thursday." She understood then that the letter to Mr. Grantley had found its way to a reader she had not addressed it to, and she understood that she was not angry about this, which was itself a form of information she had not previously possessed about herself. "Edmund's January fee," she said. It came out lower than she intended, a statement of the thing she could not step past. "Is settled," he said. "As of this morning. Mr. Grantley has the instrument. You may confirm it with him at any time you find convenient." Lady Dorothea's fan resumed moving, but at a different tempo. Miss Vane was looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone revising a very confident expectation. Josephine became aware that her hand was still in his, which she had not allowed herself to register until this moment, and that his hand was warm, and that the upper rooms were considerably more complicated than she had found them on any previous visit. "You did not need to do that," she said. "No," he said. "I did not need to. I am aware of the distinction." She looked at him for what was probably a socially inappropriate length of time and then said, "You saw me on Milsom Street." "I saw who you were on Milsom Street," he said. "I had seen it before that, but that morning I saw it without any possible argument." She should have had something sensible to say. She had always, in her own judgment, been a sensible person. The sensible thing was to point out that she had £12 and a room on Trim Street, and no social standing whatsoever, and that a duke proposing to call on her the morning after a very public gesture in the upper rooms was a situation with only one conceivable meaning, and that meaning was one she had no equipment to evaluate calmly. She said none of this. She said, "I did not receive you as a stranger in order to become one," which was something she had been thinking since the morning at Lady Sutherland's door, and had not meant to say at all. His face did something she had not seen it do before. The controlled surface of it shifted, not into warmth precisely, but into something that was the territory just before warmth, the moment before the frost on a window pane runs clear. "No," he said. "I know that." He did not release her hand immediately. When he did, it was with a deliberateness that was itself a form of statement, in a room where every statement was observed and recorded and carried home to various drawing rooms to be analyzed over the following week. Lady Dorothea had gone quite still. She was not a woman who went still unless she was calculating, and what she was calculating, Josephine thought, was whether there was any remaining instrument she could deploy against this, and arriving at the recognition that there was not. The look on her face at the end of this calculation was not precisely humility, but it was adjacent to it. The look of a woman who has been wrong in a way she cannot unknow. Miss Vane had turned to speak to a gentleman near the window and was discussing the orchestra with a composure Josephine found, despite everything, rather admirable. Mr. Grantley was there, she noticed, at the edge of the room, holding his hat and looking at the floor with the focused attention of a man who is not listening to anything at all. James offered her his arm for the next dance, and she took it, because the room was still watching, and she was not. Despite £12 and a lavender gown that had been let out twice, going to refuse the Duke of Carlo's arm in the upper rooms with his mother 12 feet away, and also, if she was going to be entirely honest with herself, because she wanted to, which was a different kind of reason, and one she permitted herself to have, very quietly. For the first time, the dance was a country set. She had not danced in 4 months. Her steps were faultless. He called on Trim Street the following morning at 10 o'clock. Josephine received him in the small front parlor the milliner permitted her to use, which contained 2 chairs, a round table, a window onto the street, and no fire yet at that hour, because she had not thought to light one until she heard his step on the stair. He noticed the cold room and said nothing about it. He sat in the chair across from her and said without preamble, "I intend to call on you formally and regularly, and I will not do you the discourtesy of pretending that my intention is not what it is." Josephine folded her hands and looked at him. "Your Grace, I have £12 and a room above a milliner's shop. I am aware of your circumstances," he said. "I do not consider them a qualification or a disqualification. I consider them a fact." "Your mother," she began. "My mother," he said, with a controlled, level precision that was not harshness, "does not choose who I call upon. She has a very high opinion of her own judgment in these matters, and her judgment is reliable in most respects. In this respect, she is wrong." Josephine considered this. "You are very certain." "I am generally too certain," he said, with the first thing that was, unmistakably, almost a wry expression, gone so quickly she might have missed it. "It has produced errors. I am trying to apply the faculty more carefully." She thought of Clara. She thought of a portrait gallery with its door closed, and a man doing the accounts in London, and the specific kind of cold precision that was the discipline of someone who had decided he could not trust himself to know what to protect. "You cannot protect everything by attending to it," she said. "And you cannot protect everything by staying away from it either." He was very still. "That is not an argument for or against anything," she said quickly. "It is merely an observation." "It is," he said slowly. "The most accurate observation anyone has made to me in a considerable time." They sat in the cold parlor with the November street outside the window and the distant sound of the milliner's girls beginning work below, and they talked for an hour and a quarter about her father's library and the estate management problems he had been trying to solve for 3 years, and Edmund's misspelled letters and what it was, precisely, that she had been reaching for when she wrote that 6th letter in June. And she found, to her considerable surprise, that she was telling the truth about all of it, which she had not done with anyone since the funeral. When he left, he paused at the door of the parlor, which was a habit she was coming to associate with him, and said, "I will call again Friday, if that is agreeable." "I will be here," she said. He nodded. He went down the stairs. Through the window, she watched him cross Trim Street and turn the corner, and then she sat for a long time in the cold parlor with her hands in her lap, and the morning light came into the window at a low November angle, and she thought, very precisely, and without embellishment, well, he called on Friday, he called on the Monday following, he called on the Wednesday after that, and on the occasion of that call, he arrived with Mr. Grantley, who was carrying a document case, and Josephine understood that the conversation was about to become a different kind of conversation. And she was right. The settlement he proposed was generous in a way that was clearly specific to her, not to the position, which was the thing that told her the most. He named a provision for Edmund through university. He named Carlow Hall as a home she would have authority over, which he offered not as a concession, but as a plain statement of how he believed a house ought to be managed. He asked her once, clearly, whether she would consider accepting his offer. And he waited in silence while she thought about it. She thought about £12 a quarter, and Johnson's dictionary, and a father who had considered the political pages part of a useful education. She thought about a portrait gallery with its door closed. She thought about standing in Milsom Street and making a calculation and walking 20 yards and knowing exactly what she could afford and being willing to spend it. She said yes. Lady Dorothea was informed by letter, which James wrote himself, in his precise hand, and which contained no apology and no request for approval, and one sentence that said, "I am satisfied that Miss Hartley possesses every quality I had understood to be rare, and I hope you will find, upon acquaintance, that your judgment and mine may arrive at the same conclusion." The letter was, by all available evidence, read at least twice. The Dowager called on Josephine the following week, and the call was correct in every formal particular, which was its own form of information. Miss Vane was at the upper rooms the following Friday with a young baronet from Somerset, who appeared very taken with her, and Josephine, who bore her no particular ill will, was glad of it. They were married in Bath in December by the canon of the Abbey, who came to Lady Sutherland's for whist, with Edmund present and pink-cheeked from the Bristol Post Road, in a ceremony of very modest attendance and very exact form, and Josephine wore a gown of dark green wool that was new and entirely hers, and fit perfectly in every seam. The drive to Carlow Hall took 3 days, through weather that turned to snow on the Wiltshire Downs, the flakes small and purposeful against the carriage glass, the countryside going white and still in the late afternoon light. Josephine sat across from her husband, who was reading the estate correspondence he had deferred for the journey, and she looked out the window at the disappearing landscape, and she thought that she had not been inside a house she considered home since the rectory, and she thought that home was a word she was, very carefully, beginning to apply to things again. Carlow Hall appeared through the trees in the last of the gray December daylight, and it was larger than she had understood it would be. Stone-built and grave, and set against a long prospect of park and field, gone white with the morning's fall. The housekeeper, a Mrs. Corey who had managed the hall for 14 years, received them in the entrance hall with a warmth that contained, just beneath the surface, a very precise assessment of Josephine. And Josephine met it with the same pleasant neutrality she had learned at Lady Sutherland's door, and trusted that the assessment would arrive at something workable in time. The fire in the library had been lit in advance, and it was burning well when they went in after supper, and the room was everything her father's library had suggested rooms could be. Floor-to-ceiling shelves and 3 large windows, and a partner's desk that had 20 years of good use on it, and Josephine stood in the middle of it, and breathed. Once, the careful breath of someone receiving something they had not entirely believed would arrive. Edmund's letter came that first week of the new year, written in his large misspelled hand, and addressed to my sister at Carlow Hall, Wiltshire, which he had underlined once as though he could not quite believe it himself. And she read it standing at the library window with the snow coming down again outside and James at the desk behind her. And the letter said, among its misspellings and news about the school's terrible mutton, that he was grateful and that he intended to make her proud of him, and that he had been to see the portrait of their father at their aunt's house in Bristol, and had told her, their aunt, what a good man he had been. And their aunt had agreed, which he found surprising and satisfying in equal measure. She put the letter on the mantelpiece, which was broad and stone and warm from the fire behind it. The following morning, she walked the length of the portrait gallery. It was a long room with tall windows on the north side and the family's accumulated faces looking out from the south wall. And halfway along she stopped at the portrait of a small girl with brown eyes and a serious expression, turned, like the others, to face the room, and she stood before it for a long time. She went back to the library and found a vase, a small blue one on the second shelf that looked as though it had been there a long time without purpose, and she went out to the garden in the snow and found, at the base of the south-facing wall, a handful of white winter jasmine still in flower, stubborn and slight and cold to the touch, and she cut enough for the vase and carried it back inside and up the long gallery and set it on the narrow ledge beneath Clara's portrait, and straightened it, and stood back. James was in the doorway of the gallery. She had not heard him come. She looked at him, and he looked at the small vase of white jasmine, and the particular closed quality that had been in his face for a year came apart in a way that was not dramatic and not loud and was entirely, thoroughly real. He walked the length of the gallery and stood beside her and looked at the portrait, and they did not speak for a time, and the snow outside the gallery's north windows came down in the particular silence that snow makes, covering the long park and the stone walls and the kitchen garden, settling on everything that had been exposed and making it, for the duration of its falling, very quiet. "She would have liked you," he said. Josephine slipped her hand into his, which was warm and which closed around hers with the particular deliberateness she had come to understand was his form of certainty. The jasmine was small in its blue vase. The gallery was lit by one lamp at the far end, and the portrait's brown eyes were steady in the light, and the door of the gallery, which had been closed for a year, stood open at their backs. If Josephine's story moved you, leave a word in the comments. Stories like hers remind us why we keep listening.